Right, so greetings, hello, welcome to our philosophy club here in the heartland of ancient Gaul, where the Druids used to be the intelligentsia, up to and including and after Caesar came and conquered them all, tried to. But they lived on, and we're not all gone yet. One of my projects, actually, I should just say this in parenthesis, is a retrial of Caesar, because he did commit war crimes here in Gaul. He slaughtered about 1 million Celts, horrendously, a lot of Druids when he could find them. And he was never tried. He was called back to Rome by the Senate to face charges of war crimes, because the Senate had heard what he was up to in Gaul, and they said, this is not on. So he was called back to give evidence to the Senate. And instead of going, he then marched on Rome with his army, which was completely against Roman rules. And he took over the entire government, and he, sacked and killed off the senators that were trying to prescribe him. And that's what started the whole trouble, really, the can of worms of Caesarism. And it was all because he wouldn't face justice. So I think one good way to sort of right that wrong is to give him a trial late. I mean, it's only 2,000 years later, but it's still on the books as far as Druids in Gaul are concerned. And whilst we're at it, we could also have a retrial for Jesus Christ. This is the plan. I think he deserves some justice too. Found guilty under trumped up charges and should be, again, that would be nice to get that cleared as well. I'm taking the long-term perspective on justice and law here. There's at the Ministry of Justice in Paris, there's a wonderful slogan on the wall that says, tempus fugit, statuus, time flies, but justice remains. And that's a famous quote. I think it's from Horace, Roman poet, but yeah, I echo those sentiments. So let's have a retrial for Caesar and for Jesus, and let's see, that would clear the air a bit, wouldn't it? Okay, that's just a little warm-up. Welcome to the Philosophy Club. I'll do a little recap of what I've been up to this week and what's been going on in the world. And of course, today is International Peace Day, 21st of September. It's celebrated all around the world, and not least here in the Musée des Muses. And it was celebrated in Guéret, my local capital, departmental capital, in La Creuse here. Our colleague Arbel, who comes to this sometimes, went along. There was music and dancing and speeches and celebrating peace, which is good, in the capital. And I'm sure there are other events all over France and all over Europe, all over the world. And then next week we're starting the UN General Assembly, and there will be leaders coming from all over the world speaking. They all get 15 minutes at the microphone, and we hope that some of those leaders are going to be recognising Palestine. Britain and France are both pledged to do that.
They have done it officially tonight, actually.
Oh, Britain and France have?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a fait accompli.
It's a done deal.
Okay. I think Portugal did as well earlier this week, and I've read.
Yeah, Norway did it some years. It was last year, I think.
Yeah, a few months back. So, that's good. So Britain and France have done the deed, right?
Australia too.
And Australia and Canada. Yeah. Anyway, their foreign ministers or heads of government are going to go to New York and give speeches about this. I don't know if Macron and Starmer will go in person. It's possible. It's a historic event. So we celebrate the International Day of Peace. We wish there was more of it. We shouldn't just celebrate it one day a year. It should be every day of the year. It should be International Peace Day. But at least, it gets it on the calendar, and it's time to coincide with the General Assembly starting up. So I want to also mention that we had a meeting earlier today, which is fitting for International Peace Day, of the Restorative Justice Council that I'm on, with Priscilla Putzman and other colleagues from all over the world, Korea, South Korea, America, California, old friends that I've known for a while. We kept each other sane during lockdown because there were some monthly talks then, when you were hardly allowed to go out of your house anywhere in the world. but they're just veteran peace activists, peacemakers. And restorative justice is the idea that if people fall out and start fighting and conflicting, you try and bring them back and restore their relationship. You get them to talk in a circle about their feelings, their grieved, hurt pride, or whatever it is. It works in schools. They have restorative circles in most schools in the States and elsewhere. It works in conflicts in business and in between parties. So it's, it's an important project. And we had some great dial-ins from people in New York and California and all over the place. So thank you to those colleagues. And it was good to do it today. The other thing I want to say is that yesterday we had the long-awaited and historic event, the 20th of September. It always takes place around about September the 11th every year, for the International Council for the History of 9/11. This is a body of historians and other scholars to discuss and debate what happened on those events back in 9/11, back in 2001, which I remember very clearly. I was then training as a religious studies teacher in the Welsh Marches. I'd been for a walk up on the Long Mynd, beautiful autumn day, blue skies, sunshine. Came back to the hotel in Church Stretton to see it all on the screens, planes flying into the building. And in a state of shock and what on earth's going on. My friends in New York immediately started saying, Thomas, we were hit by Al-Qaeda, it's all bin Laden's fault. And I said, well, okay, where's the evidence? Let's suspend judgment on this, let's look for the proof, let's wait for an investigation. But really that didn't happen. People just started going with what the media was pumping out, which is this was Al-Qaeda, this is an attack on America by Muslims, and we've got to get them back. And Bush started, let's go and get the Muslims. I suspended judgment because I've been a higher education teacher. I taught at the Muslim college. I have many Muslim friends, senior scholars, and that attack was anti-Islamic. Muslims are not supposed to do those kind of terrorist acts. It's completely off the scale of what a Muslim would do. And bin Laden went public and said, no, I didn't do this, soon after. And I knew senior Muslim students of mine who were, in touch with bin Laden, trying to say, let's do peace work here. Let's not do violence anymore. Stand down your troops. And I had a precognitive dream. I went to Stonehenge that year for a special access with some Druid friends. And I had a dream where I was talking to bin Laden and telling him, adopt the path of ahimsa, non-violence. Keep doing jihad, fine, but just don't use violence. It's a fool's game. And I was able to get that message through. So anyway, I suspended judgment, and I organised that November a conference in St Daniel's Library at the house where Gladstone used to live, the best Prime Minister Britain ever had, in my opinion, one of. A progressive, liberal, intellectual, a philosopher, and a scholar. And he left his library to the nation. It's even bigger than mine, in a huge house, 4 times the size of mine. And he left it to the nation as a gift, in perpetuity, dedicated to divine learning, which is a beautiful thing. I've read the deeds. And so I went to there, and we hired it for the weekend, and we invited a bunch of intellectuals and speakers and writers and thinkers. Jane Goodall came, the woman that's worked with chimpanzees, and other people of that calibre. And I chaired the whole thing, and we discussed, well, okay, so this is a tragedy, 9/11. So what are the implications for educational work? And don't forget, I was just working as a teacher by then, having taught in universities and so on. I thought I'll go and spend some time in the school system. And we had a very good conference, but we suspended judgment on what actually had happened. A few years later, I organised another meeting in Shropshire, and a woman came from the States who told me, look, Thomas, this was not what the story is telling us. She lived in California, I knew her well. she swore to me, Thomas, the research is showing this was a fake attack, a false flag. This was an inside job, and it was not done by Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda at all. They were just like the front patsies. I was shocked when I first met this idea. I thought, that can't be right, surely. I mean, somebody would have known. I mean, you know, it's all over the media. But I think, but it did jolt me into, skepticism. And then when I went up to, I then went and had set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East. I went to Israel and Palestine and talked to people there. And was trying to get, you know, a rational, honourable peace between Israel and Palestine and the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians of the Holy Land. And I thought, rationally, this is logical. Surely we all want that, don't we? But of course, by then, we'd had this war on Iraq and Afghanistan. The American military, with British support, put in troops and devastated Iraq and Afghanistan, brought war there. And yet, if the events of 9/11 were not as we were told, and it was all a sort of pre-arranged thing, all that was done on a fake, fake news. And that really shocked me, that thought. But I did some research. Let me just go and get something. Bear with me a second. Yes, I wanted to share some of the details because it's important. And I was frustrated. Why isn't peace happening? Why is everyone going to war all over the place? I was tasked by the University of London to create a Peace Studies Institute, and here I was, you know, running that. Although by then it was in Wales and then moved to Scotland. And I also was working on my PhD at the time as a historian, which was examined and passed in 2008. And I was, you know, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, 9/11 was a big thing. And during my PhD years, the studies, I decided to make 2001 the cutoff. The PhD was called The Intellectual History of the Search for Peace, 1945 to 2001. Cut-off date 2001. So then I wrote it up and finished it, and you know it was done by 2006, examined, and then from 2010 to 2017, I was in a Druid castle in Scotland, doing commentaries on the sacred texts, Christian, Jewish, Islamic core texts, doing the Quran in depth, the Gospels, the books of Enoch, and trying to work to theological reconciliation between the faiths. How can we get peace between them unless we do in-depth peacemaking, theological reconciliation? And it was during this time, 2010 to 2017, that I first really began to research the events of 9/11 in depth as a historian. I mean, I'd done my PhD, I know how to do in-depth historical research. And I looked around, I thought I saw nobody had done it. Where are all the other historians researching 9/11, I thought? Where was their monographs? Who's doing PhDs on this? You know, it's the single most important event in recent world history. It launched these horrible wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, endless wars. How come nobody's studying it? I thought it was very odd. And then I moved to France. I mean, I'm still based in Britain, but I also moved to France because my library needed a huge centre here. And that's when I had time. I spent a year and a half doing in-depth research, several hours a day, on the events of 9/11. I amassed a huge library of everyone who'd written stuff about it. I checked out which historians, if any, had written about it. And most of the research was on like the buildings, so buildings research, architects and engineers, saying this was not done by the planes. And I had to accept this evidence because I'm not an architect or an engineer, but I respect the people. More than nearly 1,000 architects and engineers signed their professional names. You know, these buildings are not, it is not possible to bring them down with 2 planes. There were 3 buildings, one of which wasn't even hit by a plane. And those buildings were built to withstand impact by planes. And so then others had discovered nanothermite in the building rubble, which is capable of bringing buildings down like that. So that was my starting point. You know, I accepted that evidence and I said, okay, the buildings are pre-wired. There was obviously a conspiracy on many levels. Well, who would have been behind that? And I just approached it logically and rationally in the sense of my book on the logic of peace. And I produced this first volume, Prolegomena to a History of 9/11. It's called a prolegomena because it's a forward to a final definitive history. We can't write that yet. We need access to evidence, and we need to access all the emails that were flying around at the time, phone records, bank records, oral testimony, film and video evidence, telephone records, legal and court evidence, police records. You know, all these things would have to be gone into by a historian or a team of historians. The Air Force evidence, flight data from the flights, plus intelligence records in America, in Britain, and Israel, and Saudi Arabia, and other countries. I mean, this is a huge project, like the Manhattan Project, where scientists came together for making weapons. I'm saying social scientists, historians should come together for peace to get to the truth of this story, because it was so damaging. And then I came up with 20 possible hypotheses as to who or what might have been behind 9/11. And I looked at possible, collusion between the USA, for instance, and Saudi intelligence. There's other possibilities. Was China involved in some way? They would have been quite happy about this event. And there's evidence that bin Laden had been to China, to Beijing, in the previous years leading up to 9/11. Was Israel in some way involved? Was Mossad or other intelligence networks of Israel connected somehow? Possibly Russia, I looked at that. Did people in the Bush cabinet have forewarning? And if so, who? Was Pakistan involved? There was also evidence that the Pakistani intelligence services had some foreknowledge and had been helping fund some of the 19 hijacker people. Was Iran or Iraq involved? You know, I looked at all these things objectively and I examined them in detail. And I didn't finally come to a conclusion. I suspend judgment and I said, yeah, you know, we need an international historical commission to do this. It's not possible for one person to study all this evidence and sift it. So I set up the International Historical Commission of Inquiry into 9/11. And that's what met yesterday for its 5th meeting. I'm not going to summarise, you know, it was a 3-hour meeting. It was extremely interesting. We had a detailed talk by a Muslim speaker, Moeen Yassin, who follows the Israel did it line. Mossad was responsible. And, you know, there's a lot of evidence that maybe that's true. I contributed and I said, look, I suspend judgment. And my position on all this is I'm a Philo-Semite. So I love all the Semitic peoples, including Lebanese, Palestinians, Israelis, Egyptians, all the kind of different Semitic people. I just love them all. So I'm not going to take sides with Palestine against Israel or Israel against Palestine. That's why I set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there. I want to be objectively fair to all of them and look at the evidence. So that's taken me on some, you know, deep explorations. And there are a couple of books which I shared yesterday, just in a nutshell. There's this very important book by Ken McCarthy, I've spoken about that before, about the assassination of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, probably with the help of Mossad, because of his resistance, President Kennedy, to letting them have a nuclear weapon. It now seems pretty clear that Ben-Gurion ordered his assassination. He resigned in July after very fierce exchanges between him and Kennedy. But he set up the assassination when he was still in power. It seems, again, I suspend judgment, but the evidence gathered by Ken McCartney and Rick Sterling is pretty conclusive. Book published last year. And Ben-Gurion hated the Kennedy's father, who'd been the ambassador to Britain. His crime had been to call for peace instead of World War II. He said we have to have peace between Germany, America and Britain, the great powers of the day, and prevent World War II, which meant sitting down with Hitler and actually making a deal. And Ben-Gurion hated him for that, called him an anti-Semite and conducted a witch hunt, and probably ordered the assassination of his two sons, which is, shocking, obviously. But as a historian, I have to go where the facts point. Then there's The Devil's Chessboard, Alan Dulles and the CIA and the Rise of America's Secret Government by David Talbot. This has come out since this book was published. And it deepens the argument for hypothesis number, I think it's number 5, that possibly Mossad was involved. Now why? Okay, so David Talbot, who's an extraordinary investigator, well done David, has told the whole story of the CIA's formation by Alan Dulles and his role in World War II in Switzerland. He was an agent for the OSS in Bern and American intelligence, and then it led to the creation of the CIA. And Dulles was very, very pro-Israel. He supported its formation. Why? Okay, so what seems to be the absolute certain fact is that Dulles' main enemy was the Soviet Union. He went so far as to befriend senior Nazi agents and recruit them into the CIA because they had lots of intelligence on Russia and would be useful. Operation Paperclip. So, and that's historically what happened, including Werner von Braun, the rocket designer guy who went to the States. So Dulles was prepared to play the devil's chessboard, and his main, enemy was Stalin's Soviet Union, and you can understand why he would look askance at what the Soviets were doing in Russia to their own people, and he saw Israel as a tremendous bulwark in the Middle East to protect American interests, Western interests, how you define that, against what a lot of Arabs were doing, which is turning towards communism. There was a great link between Arab nationalism, Arab independence movements, and the Soviet system. They were attracted by the idea of communism. And so Nasser in Egypt, nationalizing the Suez Canal, and other leaders in Iraq and Iran, they were all tempted by, well, why don't we join the Soviet bloc, And what Dulles thought, and obviously he thought it through very carefully, is if the West supports and arms Israel and makes it like a mercenary of theirs in the Middle East, that'll stop that drift towards Soviet domination in the Middle East. Evidence for that is given in the book, and also James Jesus Angleton, who was Dulles' top counterintelligence agent for the CIA. His story is told in this extraordinary book. And don't forget, I studied all this for my PhD in a LSE Diplomatic History Centre. James Jesus Angleton was, you could call him an absolute, Christian Zionist. He was a Roman Catholic who utterly believed in the mission of Israel. He wasn't a Christian Zionist in the sense that it's now used as a kind of let's all happy clappy, Jesus is coming, let's all let Israel be happy and we'll all welcome the Messiah. No, he was a real politic, hard-nosed, brass tacks kind of Zionist. Namely, we need Israel to be a bulwark against the scary Arabs and their Soviet minders. And Dulles, the irony is that the Pope at this time was actually pro-Kennedy. Kennedy, there was Vatican II, and it was the Catholic Church was liberalising and very much going down the route that Kennedy wanted, which was peace. Pope John wanted peace and said so in many important encyclicals at the time. But Angleton belonged to a different school, sort of old reactionary type Catholicism, which was, and the evidence that Talbot produces is that both Dulles and Angleton were in the know on the Kennedy assassination, and they justified it to themselves. They knew Mossad was involved. There was a whole team of shooters in Dealey Plaza that gunned him down. The whole Oswald thing was just a red herring, and in fact, Angleton was in charge of Oswald's case prior to the assassination. He was his minder. He had his file, you know. He was used as a patsy, according to this book. And, well, if that's true, and it does seem to be the case, then America was the victim of a presidential coup assassination in order for Israel to get the nuclear bomb. And lo and behold, Johnson, the minute he becomes president, he gives them the atomic bomb. And they've had it ever since, and that's what's causing... I mean, the karma of all this is really, really interesting, to sort out this karma. So, okay, let's just pause there. So America, foolishly in my opinion, supports Israel, gives them a nuclear weapon, thinking it's going to help them win credibility on the Arab street. But it's super-armed a monster, it seems to me. Israel has now gone in the Gaza horror show down the genocide route, and it does so because, well, America's not going to stop us. We own them. How is that possible? Well, we know that Netanyahu was in New York on 9/11. We know he was close friends with Larry Silverstein, who owned the Twin Towers. The very strong probability is that, as I've said, Mossad was involved in this attack, planning, with CIA help. In which case, Netanyahu knows where all the bodies are buried. He knows who planned 9/11, he knows who did it, he knows which of Israel's agents were there doing it. He knows the whole story. So, you know, if anyone in America tries to say, actually, this information from Thomas Daffern is quite important, let's bring him to Congress and let's set up a commission of inquiry into 9/11 and let's support his historical commission. You know, Netanyahu's not going to come out of that looking very good, is he? He's going to come out looking like a traitor to the invisible alliance between Israel and America, but also, I'd say, to a traitor to his own people, because, you know, I don't think the vision of the early Zionists in the late 19th century was to go and terrorize all the Palestinian people, to commit genocide, to do what had been done to them tragically in Europe back to the Palestinians. That was not in the minds of any of those idealistic, you know, Zionists, early Zionist pioneers. They were utopian socialists. They set up co-ops. They wanted peace, brotherhood, and Bob Dylan and sitting around the campfire type thing. And Netanyahu's betrayed all that, as whoever else was behind 9/11 has done. So I think, you know, it's time for the Dreyfus case, the J'accuse type moment in history. We have to say J'accuse to Netanyahu and his cronies. And I was also very reluctant to go public with this and to say this, because I'm as I say, a Philo-Semite. I have many, many dear friends in Israel and in Palestine. I love them both. I hate to think that this was engineered deliberately as a false flag thing to then get America like a sort of, like as their little toy soldiers, mercenaries, to go and invade Iraq and Britain. But that's what the evidence points to. I also talked about the Gaza Tribunal's findings, Jeremy Corbyn's organised, and the horror show there, what's going on in Gaza, you know, is just shocking, the testimony. I've mentioned that before. So, you know, is it possible that the same group that are doing the Gaza Holocaust show, genocide show, could have done 9/11? Well, there's a congruity. There's a similarity of horrors. And I just say these are hypotheses I'm exploring. The Commission continues its work. There's a second volume that came out, which goes into it all. And then I'm going to update this, every few years and put in new evidence. And Moin Yassin spoke very well. You can listen to his talk about how things look from an Islamic perspective. And, if the Arab street is not happy at what's been going on in Gaza, they're beginning to rally. There's been a nuclear umbrella treaty between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, two very important military powers in the Middle East. They've now become allies. This is an absolute. It's not what Dulles thought when he thought we'll arm Israel and it'll be a listing post for the West, whatever you call the West. It's an absolute nightmare. So we had a very good discussion, and that's just some of what we talked about. You can listen to the whole conference, it'll be on there soon. We also had a very interesting conference the day before, which I chaired, on totally different but similar topic, on the nature of the Holy Grail. This is a mystical concept in Christianity, esoteric Christianity. And it was run from Edinburgh by my dear friend Neil Walker and his Centre for Interfaith Peacebuilding. And we had Kathleen Matthews and John Matthews and some other academics talking about the nature of the Holy Grail. What does it stand for symbolically? And what's its connection with the Arthurian legends? Obviously I lived in Britain for many years, and also here in France, the Holy Grail, the Lancelot stories. Lancelot came from France, actually. And the Grail legends were first written down in Norman French by Chrétien de Troyes, which I've been to. And then Wolfram von Eschenbach from Germany wrote a sequel, Parsifal. And that whole myth became very important in the Middle Ages, in the age of chivalry. The idea that you can find something very holy which will bring healing. So there were some brilliant talks online, and it was fascinating to discuss. One of the speakers was an Episcopalian priest in Oregon, fascinating chap, Peter Fritsch, who is a priest in a south of Oregon state, talking about some of the problems his parishioners face: depression, alcoholism, drug abuse, poverty. He's on the front line fighting the collapse of the American dream, if you want, and people are losing hope. And his mission as a priest is somehow to bring back some kind of light. He himself is a Jungian as well, and so he spoke very movingly about the symbolism of the Holy Grail as a symbol of individuation. Just on a footnote, it's interesting, in the story of Alan Dulles, when he was in Switzerland, he actually met Carl Jung a few times, who was a great, obviously, psychologist in Switzerland. I'd love to have recorded that conversation and listened to what they said. I think Jung would be utterly appalled at what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. It's a very far cry from his vision of peace. He wrote a paper to UNESCO at the end of World War II about how you can reach world peace through individuation when you become a true human and the need for violence falls away, which I put in my doctoral thesis. So, I also have been involved this week with the Liberal Democrats doing a philosophy forum. We have the conference going on in Bournemouth as we speak, they're meeting, and colleagues are, trying to get this idea about a think tank going. I think we need one. And I've been watching with great interest the flotilla as it makes its way to Gaza, 50 ships, and I found there's an online tracking website where you can monitor each ship as it's progressing across the Mediterranean.